Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to have you at our first meeting of the RP Book Club on the Capital Order. And Clara, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody's really excited. We have 118 people registered for this and usually about 2/3 show up. So that's pretty good. We bought 50 ebooks and we've given away all but 2. And I don't know how many people have taken advantage of the discount, but your publisher also you could buy the PDF and load it. So it was all kinds of cool things. Anyway, so I want to talk to you all about tonight's book club, because at the webinar that we did on this book, Clara ended by saying she would really like to have this be more of a discussion instead of a strict Q&A. And we think that's a great idea. We've never tried it. It's a lot of people to just have a free-flowing. But what we're asking is that you still use the Q&A window. Put, either a question or a comment you want to make, because we always get too many questions and we have to kind of select and, cover a wide range. We can't call on everyone, but we've got a lot of smart people here, so there are a lot of great questions, and we try to get a sampling. The other thing we want to do is to make it more of a conversation with Professor Mattei. We would love you to if she is talking with someone and you have a comment about that particular piece of conversation, raise your hand. We're not going to call on people just because their hands are raised, but in that case, raise your hand. I hope I'm making this clear without being too confusing. It's so great to see our old friends here. So, okay, I'm going to turn this over to my co-host, the real host, Kami John.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us. And again, we're winging this. We're going to try something different to, make it everybody's book club, not just some event RP is hosting for you to enjoy, which we often do. So again, check out the Macro and Cheese podcast on Saturdays, 8 a.m. Eastern. Check out all our, social media stuff, patronize us. Clara Mattei is an assistant professor in the economics department of the New School for Social Research, and was a 2018-2019 member of the School of Social Sciences at the Institute for Advanced Studies. Her research contributes to the history of capitalism, exploring the critical relation between economic ideas and technocratic policymaking. And I will hand the floor over to her. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really nice, and I'm impressed by how big of a community you have and how everyone participates. It's great. It's really wonderful. So thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure. So again, I think we've already had a discussion last time in which I kind of set the tone to just explain what the general project of the book looks like. So in general, I think the idea is that today we are focusing on the first part of the book. Given that supposedly you guys have read it, I think more than me trying to reiterate what is better written than spoken, maybe we can just open it up. In general, the idea here is to really explore how 100 years ago an existential crisis of capitalism occurred, and it was really a moment of breakdown of the dominant ideology of laissez-faire capitalism that had dominated until that moment, which allowed for really an opening up of the political, economic imagination, and really a lot of institutional experimentation for a new economic order and a post-capitalist society. And I think actually the experiments were, illuminating, even to try to think about how we could possibly confront the current crisis of our economic system and how, there are ways forward. So the first part of the book is fundamentally there to show that the attitude we have of thinking that there is no alternative to our current socioeconomic system is an attitude that ultimately is the result of the success of austerity, as I tried to explain in the second part of the book, but how ultimately it defeated as a rhetoric if one looks at history and takes seriously moments in which indeed you saw that a lot of alternatives were happening, were being experimented with. And so again, I think the fact that history shows how there are many alternatives, that's something that is quite empowering. And we can discuss a little bit more about what these alternatives look like, what triggered these alternatives, and a little bit about all of that I talk about in chapter 1 to chapter 4. It is a work based on archival work. So I tried to really, again, as I told you last time, I really tried to be true to the voices of the time. And most of it is from primary sources. So it took a while, but I think it does tried to revive a historical moment that is often forgotten by historians. And maybe last thing I would like to say before we open up is just this importance of situating, and I don't remember if I said this or not last time, but of situating the capital order during the 1919 crisis rather than the 1929 crisis. And this is really interesting because if you think about it, the majority of the history of the interwar period is focused on the Great Depression following the 1929 crash, right? And actually this plays an important role to justify the status quo because indeed, like the Keynesian alternative of supposed democratic capitalism was considered the democratic alternative with respect to what other possibilities were out there in that historical moment. In the 30s, the other models were Nazism, Fascism, and the Soviet Union. And so, of course, like it was an easy game to say, well, Keynesian capitalism was indeed the most democratic alternative of them all. Now, if we situate what was happening actually 10 years prior, you see that the Keynesian alternative, which was emerging, which was again about preserving the capital order, was not really the democratic alternative at all. The democratic alternative were alternatives in which really the public at large, and especially the workers, were trying to overcome wage relations, which is fundamentally what compels all of us to make a living through the mediation of money and thus ultimately abide by laws of supply and demand. And this ultimate compulsion was challenged by an idea of worker self-governance, an idea of actual conscious planning rather than the irrational anarchic dimensions of the market economy. So it's interesting that historians have not focused on the 1919 crisis. And if you do focus on the 1919 crisis, then all these what won was certainly not very democratic at all with respect to what other alternatives were on the table at that time.
You know, I usually say this at the beginning and I didn't, but please use the Q&A window for conversational topics because it'll get buried in the chat. And I see Don has a question. So we'll start with you, but other people go into the Q&A, please. And one more thing that we mentioned at the very end last time, which was, a lot of us are MMTers and MMTers get very hypersensitive if something is said that is not MMT compliant. So, and you expressed an interest, Clara, in understanding how MMT fits into your framework. So if anyone feels like they want to address something that they feel could be more MMT compliant, please do so. We love dialogue and we love people discovering what we've discovered. So let's do that. I guess we should call on Don first, right, Kami John?
Let's do it.
Okay, great.
And I just want to say, as I was reading through the book, there were some little patches to where I think she's right there, dancing around the edges of MMT, like understanding the macro.
Mm.
All right. Don. If you're ready, Don, why don't you unmute your mic?
Yeah, I'm unmuted. So
Go
hi,
ahead.
guys. It's my first time with you guys, so it's great to be part of this. And thanks, Clara, for joining us. So I'm going to read my question. So I've got 3 points on my graph in my head. The first is the World War I crisis, which you've written about, Clara, in which capitalism was found not fit for purpose. So it seems to me the second great crisis was World War II. Now, I don't know enough about World War II to know whether capitalism saved the day or was found similarly wanting, although governments certainly took control. The third is today's climate polycrisis, and we're being told that capitalism will save us, although anyone with a knowledge of MMT, I think, would agree that this is nonsense. The question then is, do you agree that capitalism cannot save us from the existential climate, biodiversity, environmental pollution crisis, and that governments absolutely have to take control?
Yes, I would definitely agree. For sure. I think that part of the reason why I wrote with this book was that it is important to really deeply understand the logic of how capitalism functions, and one would understand that we are dominated. I mean, Marx's first chapter of Capital is all about the domination of the value form, which fundamentally means that everyone from the workers to the capitalists are basically compelled to participate in this real competition that is ultimately about trying to decrease the socially necessary labor time, which ultimately means that the objective of our system, it cannot be an objective that is qualitative and about political priorities, but it is the motor, the engine, is the driver, is this quest to survive real competition, and thus really to try to maximize profits by pushing down costs. And this is definitely not a logic that is at all compatible with qualitative purposes and political necessities. And I think this is really obvious right now, is how ultimately, as usual, the few win from all types of crisis, from the inflation crisis, from the climate crisis. There are really big asset managers right now that are investing in green infrastructure. And of course, the logic for this investment is maximizing returns and a short-term logic of making that investment extremely valuable, but valuable in the sense of the exchange value, which ultimately means that actually try to cut costs and attract investment. But this has nothing to do with actually our necessity to preserve the planet. So clearly it is a system that the very logic of a system is a logic that is extractive, is exploitative, and is structurally incompatible with preservation of social justice and especially climate equality. So this is definitely the case. And to connect it with, this is actually connected to intuition that contemporaries during the First World War were already having, in the sense that it became very clear to them that the market capitalism was incapable of providing sufficient means to actually be strong enough to win the war. So I don't know if you guys remember the part on chapter 1, but I think it's actually very important to see how reluctantly really bureaucrats had to give up the idea that the capitalism as they had seen it until that moment was actually going to provide the solutions to confront the war crisis. And this is actually quite important. There's that part in the book at page 28 in which they were talking about the ship industry, right? And it was all about the fact that, I mean, we could read it together if you want. The end of page 28 The faith in the market took a while to dissipate. As British Parliamentary Secretary to the Ministry of Shipping, Leo George Money wrote, "Only once we had been brought to the edge of the abyss did the state give up doctrinaire individualism." The case of British shipping was exemplary since, as the British War Cabinet reported to Parliament, if shipping failed, we could neither continue in the war nor maintain our population. Once the war broke out, the contrast between public needs and private interests plainly surfaced. It was highly profitable to sell British ships to foreigners, and the British nation lost enormous tonnage. By February 1917, private ship owners sold ships abroad at such a rate that the fate of Britain literally hung in the balance. There were not even sufficient ships to import the bare necessities of a nation at war. Reluctantly, British bureaucrats had to rethink their priorities, and the word of civil servant Lloyd echoed this conversion. National organization and centralized control were found to be more effective than high prices and laissez-faire in stimulating supply. Through a series of fits and starts, improvisation, and experiments, the British state took charge of the vast range of the nation's economic activity and gradually developed an organic system of control. Its power reached into almost every aspect of national life. By 1918, direct or indirect control of industry and agriculture was virtually all-pervasive. So clearly you see here that bureaucrats at the time had to realize that, yes, capitalism was not even really efficient to deliver on the priorities of basically national security. Now, the type of state intervention during the war was a state intervention from above and was the intervention of a capitalist state to fundamentally secure enough capital accumulation, enough productive investment to actually be able to build industrial power to win against the enemy nations. This was a type of state intervention that triggered the realization that the state was actually intervening to increase the rate of exploitation, right? So I wonder for today, going back to the question about today, is the solution really state investment if we preserve the understanding of a state as a capitalist state? And that's where I would have doubts, right? Because the point here is that in an analysis that is quite, I think also something that someone like Polanyi saw very well, and he's definitely someone who has influenced MMT, thinking the market and the state are two institutions that permanently require one another and that operate according to a logic that is very compatible. So I'm under the understanding that what the capitalist state does right now is, for example, do these private-public partnerships with these great asset managers in order to actually de-risk their investment in green infrastructure. But this, again, is not a logic that tries to go against the profit logic. It just tries to incentivize the profit makers so as to attract their investment towards supposed green technology. And I really don't think, just as during the war, there was no time to keep believing in the invisible hand, so too, I think today there is really no time to just indulge in the state just trying to really attract and private investment and thus invest in a way that is compatible with the market economy. I think we really need to rethink political institutions that are post-capitalist. And this is something that indeed was happening after the First World War, and they were quite successful. And I do think that you were saying about MMT, I do think that a lot of experiments that I describe in chapter 2 are under the same vein of the fact that we should stop believing in the priority of economic necessity as a natural constraint and realize that actually political change can lead to a lot more space for social transformation. But this political change also, I think, entails a rethinking of the concept of the state altogether. And especially at this moment, the capitalist state will not be able to provide us with the solution to the crisis of the climate crisis.
100%. All right, we're going to go to Patrick. He's got his hand up to touch on this, I believe. But yeah, go ahead, Patrick.
I just want to thank you for this book, and I think it's just amazingly clear. And the research and the fact that you focus on this pivotal hinge point in history of global capitalism is so useful. So really, building on what you wrote, and I've only read the first 4 chapters, isn't it possible to take this method, and I hope you will in your later research and your later writing, isn't it possible to take this and apply it much more broadly with the same exact analysis and the same deep reading into the factual circumstances? And I'm just giving you the 3 examples that jump to my mind. I lived through the New York City bankruptcy. I just took a course on it with Andy Battle at the Brooklyn Institute, and we've lived through a version of it here in Michigan with our emergency manager law. So I was involved in litigating the Detroit bankruptcy water shutoffs and involved in the Flint water crisis. So I have a model in my mind for thinking about how this austerity works on the ground, okay, just in terms of reordering everything. And it's very uneven geographically, but it also was catastrophic across the board for citizens for the entire region. And so my question is, can't you apply your model more broadly? Because, in the 70s, we had what Arrighi was saying was the decline in profitability and the oil price shocks and the rise of capital mobility. And I worked at the Senate Banking Committee when Volcker was doing his price shock in 1980. And I witnessed how my senator, who was from an IBM job and a Harvard Business School background, was there inflicting harm that resulted in closing of 5 factories in Flint. And, he was doing the work of a larger cause, as you described in the book, and yet very popular in his hometown, which was suffering damage. And then I was out there as a probation officer watching a higher level of unemployment than since the Great Depression. 1 out of 4 houses foreclosed on. It was turning into a ghost town. So those were examples that I thought of: the austerity of the 70s, the austerity after the world financial crisis in 2008 and 9. And it just seems like you could take the factual record of those events and you could write a whole new book and just build it out from there using the model. So how does the period you're discussing differ from those periods? And then how do you answer the critique that what you're describing is a much larger story? I know you say that in the introduction, but I just wanted to hear your more broad thoughts about that.
Yeah, thank you. That's important. So I think there are some tendencies in the history of capitalism, and these tendencies are quite peculiar to capitalism itself. So they can be traced, and similarities, of course, history never repeats itself. But certainly this dynamic of rupture with the status quo, or attempted rupture with the status quo, and the counteraction of austerity as this militant effort to foreclose these alternatives is something that we see over and over in the history of the 20th and 21st century capitalism. So I completely agree with you. My idea here is that if we focus on a moment in which this class warfare is very, very explicit and obvious, and you've read the first part of the book in which you really see kind of how really, as I put it, like the workers stormed the stage of history, and they were like actually actively demanding participation in economic decisions, but in general, even most importantly, self-management of industry. It is in these moments of explicit class warfare that I think dynamics that recur also in other moments in the 20th and 21st century maybe more subtly become very, very clear. So that's why I wanted to focus on this case, because I think this case like really makes explicit, evident type of dynamics and reactions that constantly recur, but maybe more subtly and less obviously. So yes, I think it's really important though to look at the origins of all of this as well, so that what we see in the 70s is not understood as an exception, right? This is really, for me, the crux also for my next book project I'm going to be writing about, is that the idea that the left is focused on neoliberalism as the exception to the norm is really, really bothering for me, because I really feel that that's like really a soft criticism of the system that doesn't go to the core of its functioning. And so that's why the long history of austerity needs to really be put into light, to just stress how it's not just neoliberalism that is the problem. Austerity is not the product of neoliberalism. And the crisis of the 70s that you so well describe, and that concretely exacerbate and bring austerity to the extremes, are an expression of dynamics that are much more structural to our economic system. And this is really, really important. So that's why, like, I focus in a moment in which this class warfare is very explicit. So, but this class warfare and this constant necessity to protect the capital order in these moments in which the capital order is questioned, challenged, is really, really, really important for us to actually build the critical tools to be able to analyze other episodes in history that present similar dynamics. Of course, not the same dynamics, but definitely similar dynamics.
Steve's got a question. Steve Grumbine, who's the founder and CEO of RP. All right. Steve asks, state theory of money shows that money is a creature of the state. Deregulation has allowed this to be confused, but understanding that money is a creature of the state, we know that the working class could own the means of production, self-directed social order. But since we have forgotten that money is a patent of the state, how can we merge socialists' ideas and an understanding that money is a creature of law and a creature of the state? Taxes do not fund spending. Taxes pull money from the economy, and new spending creates money. The history shows us that we could do great things, not respecting Keynes.
Yeah. So again, I think this perspective is very important to increase our political imagination and really go against the idea that we are stuck in these economic necessities. So I think it is really important in order to indeed present possibilities that are post-capitalist, that I would agree with completely. I would say, though, that I was just sorry, I'm really annoying, but I was just this morning teaching my students the first chapter of Capital, the section on commodity fetishism. And I think there is something to the theory that money is ultimately the expression of private individual production, right? And private individual production, meaning that indeed we have constructed a world by which, instead of consciously planning what we produce and distribute, this is left to private independent production. And that's really the way one is able to exchange goods without a plan, is this mediation through the universal equivalent that is money, right? So basically, in that theory, money really reflects what are the prerequisites of a society that is based on an anarchic market rather than a socially conscious plan. And that's why ultimately in that theory, then we can say that we are ultimately ruled by this value form, because we are compelled, if we want to survive market competition, to constantly try to diminish prices through curtailing socially necessary labor time. And as workers, we are compelled to go and sell our capacity to work in exchange for a wage. So this economic compulsion is part of the rule of the value form that is expressed in money, which is typical of the capitalist economy. So I don't think the two are incompatible. One could still stress that the state has a lot of space to actually maneuver our monetary resources. But I do think that it is important to fully understand what are the compulsions and this theory of domination that is ultimately very specific to capitalism. Because it's only if we understand what are indeed the drivers of our economic system that we are actually able to propose forms of socialism, quote unquote, that are not self-defeating, because they're ultimately forms that only at the surface seem different. But actually, if you look at, they, for example, propose forms of market. The exponents of market socialism, ultimately, in this view, have not really understood how money does compel what we do in a way that is really, really important and specific to our society. So I don't know if, the interesting part would be to understand how much the MMT version of money is compatible with also this version that tells you that, in a way, this private, independent production facilitates the emergence of money as this universal equivalent that is ultimately really shaping our behavior in ways that is very, very oppressive. And so what is the way out is also to understand that the fact that we need to kind of reach away from market dependence altogether in order to be able to overcome these limits that the laws of the market impose on us.
Yes, indeed. And we're bringing the big guns out. Derek Varn is here with us and has a little something. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, I was reading in these first chapters, particularly chapter 2, the history of class collaborationism as a way of dealing with various crisis, capital, and war production. And one of the things that hit me, and I'm in a mixed crowd, and I'm probably one of the few Marxists here, which is not to few very strictly orthodox Marxists here. I was wondering if for MMTers, I'm not here to question their conceptions of macroeconomy, because I think it's mostly true, but it does seem to me that and the way it is presented, it could be given to the same kinds of things we saw with Keynesianism, which is also part of its partial origin story. And I think that element of class understanding seems to be absent from pure macroeconomics, because descriptively it's not important. Like when you're looking at the way money works, you're not looking necessarily at the way the state that employs said money actually is utilizing said money. But if you were going to suggest any time period for, say, socialistic MMTers to look at in the early 20th century to kind of avoid being co-opted like that, what might you suggest based off of the early chapters of your book?
Can you just repeat the very last part of the question?
Like, what if you were going to suggest, like, hey, looking at how this capital order was developed in the beginnings of World War I and World War II, and you don't want to get utilized the way Keynesianism was utilized, and in the case of Keynes, that was deliberate on his part. But what would you tell MMTers to look at to avoid, like, when someone's using their theory in a way that might be pernicious to the goals of the people here?
I'm not sure I understood. Sorry, I'm also really tired. I'm not sure I understood. So basically, you're saying there's class collaborationism. Clearly, there's an attempted class collaborationism or forms in chapter 2, right?
Yeah.
And this ultimately goes with the framework that some of these bureaucrats clearly weren't really understanding class conflict, but we're looking more at the economy in general, right? So this idea, the macro as a general. Okay, and then from that, where do we want to go?
So my question was, if I was going to ask, like, if I was going to say, hey, study this period of the way Keynesianism was employed so that your political project around this macroeconomic conception can not be utilized by people to do that, where would you tell people to look as a historical, like as a negative case point? Because that is what happened with a lot of even post-Keynesian theory.
Yeah.
It was utilized.
Yeah, definitely. So thanks. So actually, that's going to be more helpful. Like once I read the second book, which is actually going to be a critical reassessment of Keynesianism after the Second World War. And there, the thesis is fundamentally that there is a good dose of austerity that I think is required for actually realized Keynesianism to function. And this, I think, becomes clear after the Second World War. But I think in terms of the what we can learn from the historical episodes after the First World War, I think it's really interesting because the experiments I look at in chapter 2 are definitely less radical than those I look at in chapter 3 and chapter 4. Mm-hmm. In terms of clearly still seeing the state in its capitalist form play a key role to distribute resources. But at the same time, I do think that there were a lot of intuitions there that were akin to the MMT story, in the sense that there was really an understanding that once the war had shown that there was no limit to resources when it was about winning the war, right? The fact that the state had indeed had the capacity to spend and to produce directly and to really expand the arms of macroeconomic policy. It was very difficult to convince people that that was an exception rather than the new norm, in which indeed the state could take on a much more active role as social distributor. And I think those experiments of chapter 2 are actually way more radical than the Keynesian version of expansionary fiscal and monetary policy, if you like, because indeed there's many quotes and many that I tried to revitalize in chapter 2 that really show how the idea was really to emancipate political priorities from economic ones. And this is something that Keynes really never did, to the point that, of course, Keynes, as you will explore in the second part of the book, Keynes himself was a huge supporter of austerity in 1920 because he feared that inflation would provoke the breakdown of the capital order. So for Keynes, the priority were straight. The priorities were economic priorities. The priority was to stabilize money, and the way out at that point, in order to not propel a potential political breakthrough with an idea of actually planning and something of that sort, was for him deflation. Exactly what we're seeing right now, which is also the strategy that a lot of Keynesians are taking right now, is, well, the only way forward for inflation right now is, in fact, to deflate heavily. And this is clearly a very political decision, which comes out, I believe, from ultimately a very technocratic view that the political and the economic are separate, and that really what matters is ultimately that the political protect the economic. And I think this is something that, I would say that this book shows how Keynes and a lot of Keynesianism, and this is, I tried to express it in quite a critical way in the afterword of the book, if you have the chance to read it, is that Keynes was much more similar to the austerity, reaction than one would think. And this I will explore in my next book, to look at how that played out also after the Second World War. Well, I do think that what's interesting is that a lot of radical redistributive measures that I think also some exponents of MMT would favor were experimented with in chapter 2 with a logic that was much more radical than Keynes. Again, with the idea that actually social distribution was a priority on its own right. For Keynes, social redistribution is only instrumental in moments of economic downturn to arrive at the optimal utilization of resources in the economy, right? So for Keynes, the real issue is that the level of our resource utilization during depressions is too low. And of course, in moments of economic boom, the problem is the opposite, that potentially we are actually overheating the economy. And at that point, of course, we know that the automatic stabilizers tell us to go the other direction. So for Keynes, clearly the priority was social distribution when, if and when necessary, of course, only a moment of downturn, not of upturn, to bring about fundamentally the positive animal spirits of the investors and to create a favorable environment for private investors, because that's ultimately, he never went away from that priority of having to attract private investment. As he put it in the general theory, the whole point is to create a atmosphere that is congenial to the average businessman. So I do think that what we saw in chapter 2 was something slightly different, was an idea that we could break away with the idea that economic priorities came first. Then what did it propel? Well, according to my thesis of chapter 2, this propelled, given that this intuitions brought about further demands. So this middle way wasn't really working at the time, because indeed the bargaining power was on the side of the workers who were pushing for more. And especially pushing away from a capitalist state, which by definition has as the priorities economic priorities. So it escalated. So there were political limits to these social redistribution that were very clear, and that's why either you would go all the way in a different direction, changing the fundamentals of the economy altogether. And thus really disregarding private profit as the motor of the economy, or you reverted to austerity as Keynes and the austerity technocrats did, which is what I describe in the second part of the book.
All right. Robert, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Actually, it's more a comment, but I'm happy to be able to present this. I was listening, as I normally do, to a book called In the Wake of the Plague by Norman F. Cantor. And he talks about the 1370s, the Black Death, had caused a critical labor shortage, especially in rural areas. The peasants took advantage of the labor market operating in their favor to demand steep increases in wages from the landlords. The aristocracy and gentry responded by using parliament to force through laws holding down workers' wages against the inflationary labor market. This governmental intervention was a prime cause of the outbreak of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in eastern England, the greatest proletarian rising before the 18th century. Urged on by radical clerics, the rebellious peasants came close to bringing down the government and establishing a Christian socialist regime. Had you heard about this, or you knew about this event? So it's interesting. Because I had read that the first part of the book, I was really attuned to seeing that, and I thought that was something that was germane. But here's something that happens like 450 years before labor unrest in 1920s, and they use essentially the same methodology.
That's really interesting. Already in 1381?
Yes.
Wow, that's barely, there's debates of whether that would be even considered capitalist for many historians.
Well, but it was more from the standpoint of the labor control than anything else.
Right.
And that I think is the key factor, because they were absolutely trying to figure out how they could reduce their costs. Sounds like present day capitalist to me.
Definitely. No, definitely. It's very interesting how they were already using, it seems even strange, because ultimately what one would need to figure out was whether at that moment market dependent. What did the story take place? Sorry, repeat the place.
Actually in England, in eastern England, and it came to a head in London.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because it's also a matter of like figuring out how much market dependence was diffused as a general social condition, right? Which for many historians of capitalism really marks the uniqueness of the economic compulsion is the fact that the people had lost the means of subsistence. And in what you will see in the second part of the book is that the argument I make is that actually once you want to suppress inflation by increasing the interest rates and cause unemployment, this ultimately actually silences the working people because they ultimately have no option to opt out. But they need to basically, once they are weakened, they go and accept lower wages, which is exactly, of course, what the Fed is trying to do at this very moment, is to cool down the labor market so that wages can drop. And it's interesting because it seems to me that the story you're telling, actually, it's about the fact that once the state did try to ultimately intervene through monetary policies to repress the workers and control the workforce, this actually triggered further protests, right? That's what you were seeing. So I wonder whether I wonder whether that's because actually the peasantry was still in a way self-sufficient in large degrees, right? So you see what I mean? So the compulsion of the dials of macroeconomic management to increase unemployment, to weaken the workforce, given that we were still not in a phase of a full phase of capitalism. It was actually slowly happening, right? The process of market dependence was slowly diffusing in Britain in those years. Then maybe that, in fact, left some space for actual political revolt against these measures because those who were going to be hit hard were still capable of opting out from the market and had their means of subsistence and thus could, in a way, react. Does that make sense? I don't know. I'm just speculating here.
Yeah, that sounds good.
But I think it's interesting to note that like the big point about austerity, as you will see, is to increase its market dependence. But it ultimately presupposes that labor has been commodified and wage relations have become uniformed across society. And this in Britain as well took a very long time to happen, right? The process of the enclosures went on from 1400s all the way to the 1800s. And it's really like if you read E.P. Thompson, the making of the working class with full-blown fact that, you have really no alternatives but to sell your labor force on the market happens after, which means that then we are much more dependent on decisions such as increasing interest rates than otherwise. Because if we have our means of subsistence, of course, we can also rebel actively against these measures.
Great question. All right. And looks like our good friend Ganesh has a little something to say on this topic.
Oh, actually, I had raised my hand for the previous topic, but I'll go ahead and ask my question. I'd also put it in or comment. Clara, first of all, thanks for this book. Enjoying it, loving it. You were talking about chapter 2, where you bring in ideas which are sort of similar to MMT, and I literally have it underlined on page 58, where you say, right at the top, the war had revealed to all, workers and bureaucrats alike, that economic priorities were actually political priorities. And thanks to unorthodox finance, the state could meet political objectives at any financial cost. Indeed, once the gold standard constraint was removed, the possibilities that emerged opened new horizons for social expenditure. Suddenly, no expenditure towards social measures that were within the society's resource capabilities seemed beyond financial possibility. I do not understand how someone who writes this would say that they do not get MMT or are not an expert on MMT, because to me, this is literally the definition of it. Kind of seeing it right there. So I was like, my question to you was, as you put this down, like this to me is MMT. Do you see a difference between this and what you hear from MMT scholars or people?
I didn't do my homework to read enough about the MMT before. I mean, I read Stephanie Kelton. I read what's his name? One of the founders. With an R.
Randy Ray.
Thank you. Yes. So I've read some of that, but I think there's a whole bunch of also I guess, geopolitical issue that one should consider in this historical moment. But I do think that, yes, that the intuitions of, as you read that passage, definitely, I think that I think is a really important intuition that seems to be present in MNT, is the fact that ultimately economic decisions are deeply political decisions, and economic institutions are institutions that we have collectively put together. And in this sense, there are limits that can be, most of the limits are also politically constructed. And the space for expansionary state finance is definitely always much more than what the mainstream has us believe. And this is all, I think, really important. And these actors were seeing it very, very clearly. And I would definitely endorse that line. But I do think that the question of class, the class analysis element, also potentially complexifies a little bit the issue, because I do think, as, by the way, I think the historical example of Chapter 2 shows, that once the state decides to expand its capacities of maneuver in a way that breach the limits of what was before thought possible, this may have political consequences that really require at that point a step away from the status quo that is much more radical than even the MMT framework starts off with, which I think makes sense, in the sense that I do agree that it doesn't make sense to abstractly think about a new society as a template that we can just imagine coming in a million years. The whole point here, I think, is to start with what we can do. So MMT is about starting with the current possibilities of action of the capitalist state, and showing that indeed a lot of these limits are politically constructed limits and they can be overcome. If there is the political will, of course, which is a big issue. But then I also think that there is the issue of, well, once this happens, given that, and again, here it's where I would insert a lens that is more of the classical political economy tradition, which focuses on the social relations grounding our society. If though, once you do intervene, this shakes the what has made people consent to a system that ultimately subordinates them, then you see that you would need to potentially also rethink the wage relation altogether. So in what I'm trying to say, I think that fiscal and monetary measures can be expanded in ways that are socially purposeful, just like MMT is indicating. But I do think that then one has to confront the issue that this may well and should, I think, shake up the fundamental labor relations that are at the basis of our society, which we should not take for granted, especially because the majority suffers from these conditions of subordinated wage labor, right? And so at that point, I think that these fiscal and monetary measures open up the questioning of the more foundational class relations that are the basic substance of our way we organize production under capitalism. So at that, so sorry, just to say, so I think it's really important to start with the elements we have, and so it's not utopian. We could do it now, and MMT is about what we could actually do now, which is really important, and expand these political possibilities. But this may entail, as I think it's very healthy if it did, that then this is just a first step to a much bigger social transformation, which is indeed triggered by these first breaches of the Orthodox faith. And so this state interventionism in line with MMT may require then further moves, which are actually more radical somehow, because they may trigger the imagination of people who are just not willing to go to work for a low wage anymore, right? So so you see what I mean? So I think the MMT perspective should be then open to potential for like further social transformation. I think that's good, and I don't think that can like be thought about now, because first you would need to enact the first measures that would allow to like see further, and then see what needs to be done further to actually enhance greater economic democracy.
Yep. And I was actually going to comment also on the previous topic of co-opting MMT. One of the thoughts that I had, and I probably not very well formed, was that in some of these historical periods when the crisis of capitalism is happening, it's a huge problem. And one of the ways people are responding to that is potentially with, upending the system. But in nearer term time, like what we've seen in the last 15, 20 years, it almost seems like when the crisis of capitalism comes in, the state comes in, literally uses MMT to solve the crisis of capitalism by capitalizing the banks or whatever it is that they have to do to reinforce the capital order. Then they walk away and impose austerity on the rest of us.
Right.
So it's almost as if they're co-opting MMT just to solve the
Absolutely
crisis of capitalism, and then they continue in the same process going forward. So I feel like there is that co-opting that's going on in the background.
No, I completely agree. But that's again, that is the role of the capitalist state, is to ultimately stabilize capital. So you can use these measures, but as soon, and I think this is, I mean, I don't remember if we talked about it last time, but I think it is really important to like think about what just happened with the COVID crisis. The state did intervene to preserve fundamentally capital accumulation in a moment in which it was challenged by the general lockdown. But this, and as you put it, like it was completely within the framework of let's use MMT or like social redistributive measures or expansionary policies to stabilize the capital order. But then you see what happened there was that indeed this state taking on different roles, similarly to what we see in the first part of my book. It's really interesting to notice that this did bring a lot of people to question wage relations altogether, right? And this is really the big problem that we're confronting right now. I mean, big problem if we want to preserve the system, is that a lot of people are just giving up going to work altogether. The Great Resignation is not only a phenomenon, by the way, in the United States. It's true all over, also China, for example. So this fact that the tight labor market by people giving up going to work, strikes, greater unionization, pressure to increase nominal wages, for many, this is the result of the fact that people saw greater space of thinking about a different way of organizing society, given that the state had intervened in a way that was in a way special or rare. We've seen that this has happened in other moments of history, but definitely that had an impact on the imagination of the majority. And of course, then at this point, given that this has actually shaken the capital order, now we see that austerity is necessary to make sure that things don't go too wild and that workers accept their condition of wage workers once more. So I agree with you and that's what I was saying a minute ago, right? Once MMT measures are actually used, and this may empower people to ask to go beyond wage relations, then I think that's where the MMTers should endorse greater structural change that could potentially lead us to a society that it's organized according to different principles altogether, and especially organized on some form of conscious, going back to the very first question, how to solve climate crisis, actually some conscious deliberation, to not use the word planning because it's taboo, but deliberation coming from the people and towards how to organize production distribution.
All right. I just want to give a big shout out to Eric Kessner. Good seeing you out there, buddy. And Jonathan Cadman, why don't you unmute and...
Hello, Professor. Good to talk to you again. I am working on my third rereading now. of your book. This time I decided in advance of this to only focus on the first half, and I'm not going to start reading the second half till after we're done here tonight. But I may save that till a little closer to the actual date of the second one. But something different jumps out at me every time I read it. And this time around, it was kind of the discrepancy in some of the examples you cited in kind of a certain level of naivete about how the capital elites and the existing social order was going to react, like almost like with these really clever experiments in the UK with builders guilds and co-ops. It was almost like they thought we could just prove how well this works, what good things we can do, then they'll leave us alone and let us go on, which obviously is not how it worked out. And the ones who seemed to really anticipate the kind of hostile response they would get from the power that be were, the people in northern Italy, Gramsci and the Turin people. They had this really well designed, really well planned out action. They had these people, you said, trained so that basically they could do a massive widespread work stoppage, in a matter of minutes once the order came down. They had security set up, they had barricades set up, they knew exactly what they were doing. And you could make the argument they may have underestimated it, at the end of the day, what kind of force was going to be brought to bear on them. But, they, like the discrepancies between those kinds of examples were in the kind of compare contrast of the difference in outcomes between those who anticipate and do things to thwart the anticipated response versus, the kinds of people that, think everything's going to be okay if we can just, develop this project works so well. And that, I was wondering if you'd go into a little bit about that.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. That's a really a good insight. And it goes back, I think, to what we were saying also a minute ago, in the sense that I think it is the case that a lot of the British working class, especially unions, were much more integrated within the ideology of the state as being ultimately an institution that represented everyone equally, right? This idea of formal equality in front of the law, as of course one of the great achievements of a capitalist society, was something that I think many of these workers in Britain that participated in more traditional unions were very attracted to. And this is why ultimately the state was understood as this kind of like neutral universal actor that could in fact propel towards social transformation, even of a radical type, like the one of the Sankey Committee, which is all about actual participation of the workers in the management of coal, together with nationalization, or the case of the guilds, in which indeed the idea was that production was happening for use, like reintroducing the concept of use value that would actually overcome and basically obliterate the priority of value in the sense of exchange value in our economy. So there was this faith in the constitutional means of the capitalist state as fundamentally an actor that could indeed embody the general interest. And this is something that clearly the shop stewards, radical shop stewards movement in Britain, especially in Scotland, that was like the place where they were most active, were completely against. And this is the lineage of what happened in Italy with Gramsci and Togliatti and Ordine Nuovo ultimately took inspiration from these movements that were explicitly anti-state, anti-capitalist state, and right, they were talking about the servile state, and the servile state actually was was indeed manifested clearly during the war, in which indeed the government had acted explicitly to curb the bargaining power of the workers with the leaving certificates and much else. There was a clear sense by which the state was not neutral at all. That was like a great illusion that a lot of unions had bought into, but the radical shop stewards were all about abolishing the capitalist state through new institutions that were directly democratic through self-governance that could then, emerge into what they called a proletarian state. And so I think that's like the main difference is that, in the sense that the Gramsci council movement clearly had no faith in the state and understood that the state was run by elites that were ultimately against the understanding of overcoming classes for an idea of universal producers, everyone being producers, and everyone having a role that was on the same plane in the production distribution process. So that's maybe a 2 cent, and clearly you already knew this, but of how in a way the council movement just took much more seriously the concept of class warfare, and thus ultimately was prepared to fight in a way that was indeed aware of how much the reaction was being built. And of course, it wasn't really even enough. And that unfortunately was, there's a lot of speculation of why in Italy, the council movement ultimately didn't make it. And part of it clearly is, and this is why actually Gramsci founded the Communist Party in 1921 in Livorno, in Italy, was exactly to distance themselves from the Socialist Party, who had basically betrayed the occupation of the factories. In the moment in which many thought that was like, there was a moment in which Giolitti, who was actually the head of the government in Italy in the summer of 1920, which was the summer in which the whole peninsula saw factory occupations, and workers were just running the factories independently. And this was also happening in the countryside. There was a lot of like assemblies and self-management of the land. In this moment in which the head of the government explicitly said to the industrialists, listen, we don't have enough military force to go against all these workers, so we can't do anything. So the state just really pulled out, in the sense of saying, hey, like, we have no force to coerce these workers into their old status. This is when ultimately many think that, a lot of reconstructions show how it was the socialist party, the socialist leadership that pulled away, and that wasn't able to actually stand the ground and continue the fight for self-governance of industry. Now, what would have happened in case they did try to stand the fight? I don't know. Gramsci tries to argue that what really failed was the capacity to actually build a network that was efficient enough to organize a force that was actually as well organized as the reaction of the industrialists and the liberal intelligentsia more generally. I don't know. We can't know what would have happened, but certainly, clearly, even in the council movement, even if there was an understanding of the state as ultimately potentially an instrument of the enemy, and their capacity to predict the reaction, there is the case that the working classes weren't united enough, and a lot of actually of the socialist leadership gave up and ultimately collaborated to the defeat of the movement.
Yeah, I think there's a lesson for us today, at very least in the understanding that the the achieving of something like the seizing control of these counts, these council, the establishment of these things, any of these experiments is the beginning of the fight, not the end of the fight. Because as soon as you achieve it, you have to start fighting to keep it.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you for taking my question. I appreciate it.
I hope I answered. And thank you for reading the book so many times. It makes me feel very good.
To show off.
But the thing about today is that it's very difficult to understand. I mean, I think transformative processes can take forms that are less obviously threatening to the capital order potentially at the very beginning, and so can leave some more space to organize in time before the reaction comes. Because in terms of technological innovation, I mean, anything could be crashed in a second right now, right? So clearly, like, direct confrontation, while for me it was very interesting to see, like, Giolitti himself, the fact that he admitted that the Italian military and police force was not going to be enough to stop the factory occupation is something that I think right now and it's very and it's not something that we would hear, I believe, in the present, because the level of, like, technology to oppress people at all levels is so sophisticated that I think there is enough force for the state to intervene and to quash these forms of spontaneous self-management. So I wonder whether one would really need to rethink the strategy, because if it goes to direct confrontation, it's tough. It's tough. I feel it was tough then. Imagine now. But so I wonder, in that sense, how we should take seriously the current phase of our capitalist society and the current technological advancement, and what this means in terms of, like, strategy and tactics for social transformations.
We are going to go to Dana. You want to unmute and ask your question?
So this may seem a little like an odd question, but I know that subsistence agriculture on a large scale really died out in the U.S. in, approximately the 1940s. But there does of late seem to be an increase in that, backyard chickens, veganism, people growing container gardens, community garden, all this kind of stuff. And then at the same time, I see things like there's a movement, it's small but growing, towards sustainable independent housing that's not connected to the grid, sustainable earthship homes like those that have been developed by architect Mike Reynolds down in Taos, New Mexico. And even housing that's still somewhat on the grid, but very non-standard, RV life, that kind of stuff. And I'm just wondering, do you see the growth of these types of kind of independent things that allow people to meet, like, housing and food necessities outside the market as central to the proletariat being able to overcome capitalism and austerity? And if so, can you speak to what you would anticipate the impact of those things can be, or as we go forward, what they might be on wage labor?
Yeah, I mean, this is the key. This is really the key. The way to defeat market dependence is to create the conditions to actually opt out from market dependence, and ultimately from the fact that everything we consume is mediated by being purchased through money, and the fact that this money we have because we go to work and we get it in our paycheck. So absolutely, like, I mean, this is why ultimately, though, the control of land is so crucial in order to analyze the power of the capital order. I think that is really an important way to experiment. Also, actually, advancements in technology, so as to allow us to actually gain some form of self-sufficiency, and especially of our basic needs, through being able to ultimately even use less land and more effectively, so that even people with very, very little land can imagine achieving some form of self-sufficiency. And that's where I think like ultimately forms of like neighborhood councils could really help, because maybe you're not on your own capable of producing. That would be also very atomistic and individualistic understanding of self-sufficiency if it was like each family trying like to like hoard and like produce for oneself. But that's why I think actually the idea of like opening up to concepts of like neighborhood councils, of potentially like actually collectively producing spaces for self-sufficiency and decommodification of our basic necessities is so important, like soup kitchens, ways to actually find a way for resources to remain within the community, right? I was actually just, I don't know if we had the meeting before or after. I think I don't remember if I had come back from South Africa. I don't remember. When did we meet the other time? I don't remember. When was our first meeting?
I believe it was early April.
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
We should know that, Kami John.
Yeah. So
Yes.
I think I had been to South Africa, so I might have already even said this. But in the townships, what's really impressive is the fact that like part of why apartheid was really like maintained through economic hardship is that they never did land redistribution. And so the Black population, which is the majority, has basically no land. And in these townships, they have no land whatsoever. They're like, but what's interesting is that they are trying to like actually learn how to cultivate through containers, so that instead of, going, traveling miles away to earn a wage, coming back with this little money and spending it all on in another chain supermarket, which is the only supermarket, by the way, available there, because they're completely isolated in these townships. Then you see that like just money comes in and out, and like there's zero agency. They are trying to put together ways to actually retain their resources and potentially actually like make it such that these resources grow within, and so achieve some form of economic independence. So I think this is crucial. Like, I mean, if one analyzes really what is specific of capitalism once more, which is the fact that we are compelled by these economic forces due to the fact that we've lost our capacity to self-reproduce. So our reproduction depends on our participation in the market. Then we understand that the first step is indeed to find ways out of it. So I think that this is a really, really important direction.
We want to focus a little bit on it because it's getting late. Focus on the questions that have to do with history, since we're meeting again in 2 weeks. And so things that have to do with more current issues should be held until then. And as always, we apologize for not getting to everyone.
We're going to go to our good buddy Rahul, who's in the crowd. So why don't you go ahead when you're ready, my friend?
Hey, thank you there. Good evening, Professor Mattei. Great book. I've only read part 1, so this is my focus of the question. Just in passing, very interesting to read about World War I. It's something I'm not too familiar with, but I very much enjoyed the history that you introduced through labor relations and worker interests. So I'll just read my question very quickly. Did the wide spectrum of worker interests and models introduced post-World War I, and I just gave the examples, wage and negotiation, worker cooperatives, factory committees, ultimately lead to a lack of political unity, hence an opening for fascism in Italy and the liberal elite backlash in Great Britain? And I very much like your point in part 1 where you emphasize that politics and economics, I think deliberately by the elite, were kept separate, whereas at the worker level, it was very important to put it together. So that's kind of the motivation for my question. So thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't. I must say that it's very difficult, I guess, to measure this dispersal of forces somehow. Yeah, so that's a good point. I've never thought about it that way. I've always thought about the favorable fact that there were all these different imaginations for a future that then were played out differently and with different alternatives, so as to actually like see the breadth of the possibilities out there, from again the more reformist such as chapter 2 to the more radical such as chapter 4, right? There are degrees of radicality that also going back to what we were saying before, go with how much trust in the current institutions these groups had. But definitely, this means that they didn't necessarily agree on the way forward. So this has always been a real problem within the workers' circles and generally the left, is that there's way less unity than the unity on the right, right? And I think actually it's in chapter 4 that I wonder if I could ever find it, that Gramsci has that really important quote. Let's see if I can find it here. At the very end, alongside these developments, Gramsci's analysis could not have been more timely. Industrialists are divided among themselves because of profit, because of economic and political competition. But in front of the proletarian class, they are an iron block. Both Lenin and Gramsci foresaw the unleashing of a bourgeois reaction of a new type, one that went beyond the traditional liberal democratic framework. It was the coming of a violent civil war. So I think that's really interesting, is that ultimately, for how much, of course, there's sections of capital that are in structural competition with one another, and in conflict of interest with one another. Clearly, they are much more united against the workers than the workers usually are, and in their opposition to the capitalist class. So yeah, that's a very interesting insight. One could definitely also see that. So the thing is that again, I think I've already said this last time, but I would like to repeat it. The emphasis of the first part of the book is to present this like opening up of potential space for transformation, but it does not, I guess, and again, because it's situated there in order to then kind of like present the context in which the austerity counteroffensive emerges. I do not, though, at that point, given that that's why this first section is there, is to kind of just give the context for the austerity reaction. I don't do enough work on actually looking at the reasons why these movements presented weaknesses on their own part, right? And I think that would require actually more research and more analysis of the various reasons. And there's work on this, but I think a lot of times it's tendentious work, because there's a lot of like, I think historians who take like, somehow they have some form of, they take some form of pleasure to kind of really like insist that these groups are weak and that, like, the alternative sucked. And so like you like really see how the historians are extremely political in their own reconstruction of history and wanting to really stress the weaknesses. So there is that type of literature, but I do think that it would, with these fresh eyes, that's the one that I tried to use, it would be very interesting to like go and actually analyze what were the internal weaknesses of these movements. I focused much more on the external reaction. So your point could be much more explored, I think, and it could be very interesting to note these divisions.
All right. And Professor, you're so generous with your time. We appreciate it. Do you have time for one more before we get out of here?
Sure, no problem. Yeah, it's a pleasure.
All right. Aditya, go ahead and unmute and go ahead whenever you're ready.
Hi. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Clara. Thanks again for doing this event. Yes, you just spoke about Gramsci. So actually, that was kind of my stepping off point for actually one of my questions. And actually, I really love the inclusion of various quotes throughout this thing. I mean, I'm not a historian. I'm extremely glancingly familiar and with even some of these historical figures, including Gramsci. So this is great to get this primary thing. And so the one quote I loved from him that really kind of resonated with me is, this quote: "Economics is not a science of the economic reality, quote, as it is, but is a science of the reality as men want to build it." And, I think this is probably speaking to your thesis of, political economy and I guess the field of political economy. And to me, it kind of secondarily, it also kind of evokes this idea of, I'm always constantly comparing natural systems to nominal systems like this, whether that's a flawed comparison or not is a separate point. But anyway, I mean, I asked a question, but I think maybe I just want to rephrase it a little bit because it really has to do with, in spite of the fact that you've been describing from these, these other questions that all these things, even something as mild as like the guilds in England, ultimately failed. These are still like, hard for us today to even imagine something like this even taking root. And so I guess the point is, how, this was a paradigm shift at the time, even then, this idea of political economy, but how entrenched is this technocratic view today compared to then? I mean, they were apparently caught somewhat by surprise because they had some success, even though the capital order eventually overcame it. But today, it's even for people whom the technocratic view doesn't serve at all. It is so embedded, and I don't know. I'm just speaking from obviously our present.
I mean, that's the reason why I felt it was important, right, to this book, because as you will see from the second part of it, that's like one of the big themes is actually how is it that we take for granted this separation of the economic and the political, and this fact that instead the science of economics is just this hard truth that is natural and not at all kind of the outcome of our conscious construction. And this is really, really incredible, I think. And I do think that the operation of the education of, just like the upper middle class people that go to school and get trained in economics played a big role. And so I wonder whether the fact that these workers were just less, just to keep using Gramscian language, less, let's say, integrated in the state apparatus. And by state apparatus, I mean also like education and, the hegemonic apparatus of the time. They were less integrated because they were ultimately, many of them did not have access yet, right? Italy was indeed, again, differently from Britain, in which the working classes were being indoctrinated much more. In Italy, there was this sense of it was just the beginning of the integration of the workers within the hegemonic worldview. So I wonder if that allowed for just these types of thoughts to also be more appealing to workers, generally more open to it, right? And I do think that instead right now, many workers have completely internalized, and us included, me included, by the way, and like all my students included. So people of all different education possibilities have really, really internalized the technocratic project, to the point that also Keynesians, and this is my whole critique of Keynesianism, have as well, right? The divide between the economic and the political is something that is clearly something that the Keynesians have taken on well. And many of us, for us, we talk about inflation. It seems like only an economic problem, but we fail to see how much it's actually even in how we think about inflation. We are already taking a very, very political lens that thus has implications for the type of solutions that we can imagine. And so, yes, I would say thank you for pointing out to this part of the book. I think it's actually one of my favorite. It's really ultimately from page 108 to page 118 or 119 if you want, 116 if you just want, 108 to 116. It's 8 pages in which I really try to focus on, and it's my own reconstruction of it, right? So I did read, unfortunately they're not translated. You can find some articles of L'Ordine Nuovo translated in a book that was published, and it's called like Gramsci's pre-prison notebooks writing, Gramsci's political writing, something like that. But the majority is not translated. So I did the biggest bulk of translation was directly from the Italian newspaper that you can read online. But what I think is really important is that out of reading all of these issues, one could trace, I think, these four, what I call these like four kernels of this alternative methodology. So how these alternative institutions of the councils could really only make sense, emerge, be possible if also we change the way we thought about the world. And again, how much were these workers actually changing the way they were looking at the world? How much for them this was just like their first exposure of the lens. So maybe in that sense, they didn't really even have to escape from the indoctrination that much yet, as we would have to. I don't know. But for sure, the thing is that it was really, really radical as an alternative methodology. And those pages, I think these 5 pages really can speak to us today and really to try to escape this technocratic worldview that we take for granted without even knowing. So the one you pointed out is very important, is that how economics as a science can be used both to empower us, like Gramsci was trying to do, show how actually capitalism is not natural, how it's historically specific, how it functions, and be very historically realistic about its weaknesses, its pros and cons, and try to really understand how it operates in order to potentially overcome it. Or economic science can do the opposite. It can really disempower us, take agency away from us, and remove, as you will see from the second part of the book, literally remove the worker from any explanation of economic growth. And that's like a big thing. Like Gramsci was trying to say, the producer is the source of value. And so really gaining the agency of the worker by saying it's us as producers who are the source of everything. So we should be in charge of what we're producing and how we're distributing. And we should like take action on our own activity. What happens after with the technocratic impulse is that the workers are completely relegated to kind of secondary inputs in the production process. And really the only agency left for the workers still today in the models you learn at school is to pick and choose between leisure and labor, or to pick between one job and the other. But really the idea is that the inputs in the production process that count is capital, not labor, right? So you completely expel the labor theory of value. And that does have a big impact on kind of disempowering our minds, and thus disempowering our capacity to think concretely about alternatives. Well, I do feel like Gramsci, in these pages in which he is proposing this alternative methodology, this really is part of why it was then possible to really get active and work with these new institutions. And I would say to conclude, one of the points that for me are most important for us to inspire us right now is the fact that knowledge does not come from above, does not come from people sitting at their desks and in their privileged positions and telling everyone else what they should think. Knowledge emerges out of this concrete participation in groups, in communities, in activities of social change. And it can be small, right? It can be, in fact, like just organizing in your neighborhood, trying to get people to communicate. It can be even like through these wonderful reading groups that you guys do. Like the spaces to communicate, to discuss, to act. This is where the energy to construct a different world begins. So we really have to rid our minds with with the idea that we need to find a template given to us from like some thinker that is superior. The idea is that thought comes out of action, and you can only have thought that makes sense if it is rooted in the participation in concrete activity, which is political and economic all at once.
Absolutely. And again, thank you for your time. You've been so generous and almost 2 hours. So, and I think this went pretty good. Seemed like it had a nice flow to it. So, Mamre, do you have any way to close us out?
Well, I wanted to ask people if they like the way it went, or if they have suggestions for next time, please reach out to us. You know how to reach us. I can always be reached by email, virginia.kotz@realprogressives.org. Or on Twitter or wherever. But we're meeting again in 2 weeks, same time. So, but then you will have read the second half of the book, and a lot of the questions we didn't get to concern the present and political reality today. So I look forward to that. John, you want to tell people where to find Real Progressives' work and how to donate to the Patreon? And
Alrighty. I don't have my cheat sheet, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's Real Progressives at patreon.com.
it's patreon.com/real
Progressives. Right. Gotcha. And you can also go to our website, realprogressives.org, and there's a donation tab there. We do the Macro and Cheese podcast every Saturday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern time. And Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, usually, Steve does a live stream, The Rogue Scholar. I'm sure you're all familiar. And, Facebook, Twitter, everywhere. We're all over the place. Just come and patronize us. Help us get the word out.
Great. Clara, thanks again. I know you have an 8-month-old, so you don't get enough sleep as it is. And here we are taking more of your sleeping.
It's fine. It's really, I mean, for me, it's such an honor that so many of you are taking my work seriously and discussing it. And again, feel free also to, and this is why it's cool to write a book, is that then you feel detached from it. It's like a thing of its own. There's a lot to improve. There's a lot of that could have been done and hasn't been done. So also for next time, I'm very happy to receive, critiques, suggestions. Don't feel like because I'm here, you have to be intimidated and pretend like you agree with everything. Or I'm very happy to like get, some criticism that make a lot of sense. And this is like the reason why the book is out, is also to see how the argument can be improved or what's the weakness of it. And it's a collective project. I really don't believe in knowledge as something of the individual, right? It's a collective project. I did this through a lot of confronting myself with a lot of people, and this can happen also after the book is out, because there's always new work to write, and we can all produce this knowledge together. So let's I'm happy also so let's also be very free in the type of questions we ask also for next time. So thank you for your interest, and hopefully you'll have the time to read before we meet.
Thank you.
So cool. Until next time, everyone, we're going to head on out of here and get that second half read.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Okey-doke.
So what did I miss?
Now it's the after party. Oh, yeah.
Wow, it was really good. We can never get to all the